Good early evening to our audience as we get started with our second day of virtual Babe Ruth Birthday Bash programming, this time focusing on our guy, Babe Ruth, and the major impact of his sale to the Yankees heading into the 1920 season.
Our moderator tonight, the longtime voice of the Boston Red Sox. He was behind the mic when the curse of the Bambino spell was broken back in 2004. Our good friend, Joe Castiglione. Joining Joe, our distinguished panel, Babe Ruth historian Bill Jenkinson, senior curator for the National Baseball Hall of Fame, Tom Schreiber, award-winning Ruthian biographer Jane Levy, and former Major Leaguer, Baltimore's own Mark Teixeira.
Now, before we get started, Jay Bittner, executive director of the prestigious Engineers Club right here in Baltimore, is going to show you how to make a special Babe Ruth cocktail to go along with tonight's show.
Hello, welcome to the Engineering Society of Baltimore. We're so happy to be here and be a part of the Babe Ruth Museum's Birthday Bash. Today, what I've got for you is a beautiful cocktail I created inspired by the Babe. It's called the Bambino. My inspiration for this cocktail was a legend that talked about how Babe Ruth enjoyed rye whiskey with ginger ale. Now, it wasn't a sophisticated cocktail. He'd take a mason jar and fill it up 50-50. But for what we've got here today, I've made a Manhattan-based cocktail, and instead of ginger ale, I've made this lemon ginger shrub. Now, you may be asking, what's a shrub? Now, a shrub is like a simple syrup, and a simple syrup is usually 50% water, 50% sugar. But in this case, that water portion is split again 50-50 between water and an acid, usually apple cider vinegar. In this case, I made that acid a blend of apple cider vinegar and fresh lemon juice to get those lemon flavors in here. So we've got a beautiful ginger lemon shrub. Then we have our rye whiskey. I like to use something about 100 proof or higher because I want those spicy rye notes to come punching through the cocktail. And then we have a sweet vermouth. Today I've chosen this Via sweet vermouth, which has beautiful baking spices which add an earthy ground note and some complex baking spice underlayers to our cocktail. Last but not least, aromatic bitters. In this case, I've chosen these sexy bitters. I really don't need to say more about that. So now we're going to build our cocktail. First what we're going to do is we're going to put some ice into our mixing glass, and then we're going to measure out our ingredients. We always measure because this is the way we can make consistency in all of our cocktails, and when you make one cocktail and you enjoy it, you know the next one will turn out the same. So here we have 3 ounces of rye whiskey, and you may be saying to yourself, 3 ounces, that's a lot of whiskey. But this is Babe, and the Babe always went big. Next, we've got our sweet vermouth, and we're going to have 1.5 ounces of this beautiful Via sweet vermouth. And then after we're done with that, we're going to use 1 ounce of this lemon ginger shrub. And one of the great things about shrubs versus simple syrups is they have a very long shelf life in your freezer. They'll keep several months. And then finally, the sexy bitters. In this case, we're going to put in just 6 drops. And that's all it takes for sexiness. So now, once we have all the ingredients in, we're going to stir. Some people will go, why stir versus shake? If you shake, you're going to lose some control over the dilution of your cocktail. The other thing that happens is you get cloudiness. And so I'm working to stir here for clarity, and also so I can control, how weak my drink is going to become. You're supposed to stir until well chilled. That's very subjective, but I think this does the job. And then, before we strain into our glass, I've got another touch. We've got some pure lemon oil that I'm just going to spritz right into our glass here to help really release some of those beautiful lemon essences into our cocktail. Once you've strained that into your coupe glass or a martini glass, if that's what you have around, the final touch is a garnish. You're just going to take a fresh, wide lemon peel, which if you don't have the beautiful lemon oil, you can express the essences, but since we did that already, we're just going to use this and drop it right in our drink. And now, I say cheers. Really beautiful cocktail. And with that, I wish you adieu from the Engineering Society of Baltimore.
Thanks, Jay. Now, let's turn it over to Joe Castiglione.
Well, thank you very much, Sean and Mike. I've had the pleasure of going to the Babe Ruth Museum and birthplace many, many times. First time with the Red Sox, we were staying out at the Cross Keys in the county and took a bus down there and then the cab back to Memorial Stadium. So we've been there often, and Mike has been so good to take me to the archives, up that winding, narrow set of stairs to his office and the upper regions of the home. And also, Mike took me to then Cardinal Gibbons High, but the original St. Mary's, where, of course, Babe starred and really lived as a youngster. So I've had a lot of experience, and Mike, you've made it all possible. It's really an honor for me to be here today as a Red Sox announcer, especially because Babe started with the Red Sox. And I think the most significant move in Yankee history, and maybe at least up until this century in Red Sox history, was the 1920 sale of the Babe to the Yankees. And of course, Babe had led the Red Sox to World Series championships. In 15 as a pitcher, he didn't play much in the postseason. 16, he was a star as a pitcher, a 14-inning World Series win. And then in 1918, a chant we heard until 2004, the next time the Red Sox won another World Championship. But in 1919, the Red Sox finished sixth. And while Babe was still hitting, he was a discipline problem, wanted more money, and Harry Frazee decided to sell him. The sale was actually done the day after Christmas and announced in early January as Babe went to the Yankees, and it really turned the fortunes of everything around. Well, the Yankees had never won a pennant. They won 27 World Championships after that, and the Red Sox went down quickly. They finished fifth in 20, the year he was sold, and in 1921, and then finished last 8 of the next 9 years. Harry Frazee, who sold him, was a theater promoter, and he was not vilified at first. He proceeded, though, to sell many other Red Sox players like Joe Dugan, Carl Mays, Hall of Famers Wade Hoyt, and Herb Pennock from the Red Sox to the Yankees, and the bottom fell out for Boston. And of course, we had to hear that chant of 1918 into 2004 when the Red Sox ended what was called the curse of the Bambino, whereas he was later vilified because of his role in the sale, although not so much at the time. But when Dan Shaughnessy's 1990 book came out called Curse of the Bambino, highlighting all the near misses the Red Sox had, it was really the thing that underlined the curse. And of course, the Red Sox, we think, have broken it forever. We have a great panel today, historians, authors, and a former outstanding major league player, Bill Jenkinson, wrote the book, The Year the Babe Hit 104 Home Runs. Bill's a great historian. He tracked every one of the 714 career home runs the Babe hit and figured in that 2007 book that giving the dimensions of parks today and some of the rule changes, he would have hit at least 104 home runs in 1921, not to mention the home run of over 600 feet he hit at the Tampa Fairgrounds at an exhibition game. Gene Levy. Gene, this former Washington Post columnist and sports writer and a tremendous author. I've read all your books, Jane. First book on Sandy Koufax, which was so amazing because Sandy certainly was very private, if not reclusive, and you brought him out in a way that I've never seen before. Then your book about my childhood hero, The Last Boy, Mickey Mantle. That brought great feelings and facts about his early childhood, which were unknown, even though I've actually been to Commerce, Oklahoma, and been to Baxter Springs, Kansas, where he played for the Whiz Kids, and Joplin, Missouri. But you really dug deep and found so much about him. And of course, what I think is the ultimate Babe Ruth biography. I mean, Robert Creamer did a great book. The Big Bam by Lee Montville was outstanding, but you captured so much that we never knew, especially about Babe's childhood and private life in The Big Fella in 2018, which I've read for the second time. Tom Schreiber. Tom is a historian and a curator at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York, which we've had the chance to visit so many times. Tom is credited with finding the oldest team photograph in the history of baseball, the New York Gotham Club in 1885. He's a Babe Ruth enthusiast and has unearthed some great footage of the great Bambino. And like Bill and Jane, he's collaborated with the Babe Ruth Museum for many years. And Mark Teixeira, a guy that I called many home run off. He hit over 400 in his career. And Mark, I'll never forget the last one you hit. The Red Sox were trying to clinch the division in 2016 in Yankee Stadium, had an easy lead going to the bottom of the ninth inning. And Mark Teixeira hit a walk-off grand slam to win it for the Yankees. The Red Sox still clinched that night because Toronto lost, but it took a lot of the fun out of the postseason celebration. But 409 home runs, multi-all-star career, Dick Hauser Award winner with the Georgia Tech Club in 2000 as the outstanding collegiate player, a world championship with the Yankees, and of course, with a great Baltimore background playing at Mount St. Joe's High, where the Babe later played. So that's our outstanding panel, and we certainly have experts on the Bambino. We'd like to consider what you guys think about the Babe being sold. Was that the most impactful, or one of the most impactful moves in the history of baseball? Jay, we'll start with you.
Oh, me? Yes. Yes. It wasn't just impactful in terms of baseball. It was impactful in the whole definition and experience of the 1920s. I mean, he didn't really want to go to New York at first. He was happy, aside from with his salary. He liked Boston, but he quickly realized that, only New York was going to be big enough for him. And just by being there, he seemed to make the city even bigger and the locus of attention when it was still the locus of baseball. Had 3 major league teams at the time, obviously. And it was the center of news, of the burgeoning industry of marketing, which attached to him so fast. I mean, he was doing with his agent, Christy Walsh, everything that guys are doing today, only they have TV money to fool around with, so the dollar signs are bigger. But yes, it certainly determined a lot about the future, as you just elucidated, of the Red Sox. And it made the Yankees the financial juggernaut, the evil empire that you've been referring to God knows how many times on all your broadcasts.
Tom, certainly it had an instant impact on both franchises, as we chronicled, but that continued for more than one generation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking a century later, and the very fact that we're talking about it means something big happened in 1920. I mean, you can make all the arguments you want about what the impact was. There's a lot of important moments in baseball history. I'm not going to rank one above the other. You can talk about Jackie Robinson's pretty important guy, and the Black Sox Scandal of 1919, just before Ruth comes on the scene in New York, and actually the news didn't break until his first season with the Yankees. That has lasting repercussions, and you can even go way back to the late 1850s when they first charged admission to see a baseball game. I mean, fans were going to games for free. And, when they decided that they're going to try and charge admission and it worked, that's a major fork in the road for baseball towards professionalism. I mean, Mark wouldn't be here if it weren't for the fact that they started charging admission in 1858 and said, hey, we can make a buck off of this game. So listen, is it the most impactful? Let's say this, it's on Mount Rushmore, right? We'll put it on the Mount Rushmore of impact on the game of baseball.
Did you agree, Bill?
Yes, I do, Joe. It was a unique conjunction of person, place, and time, and the impact on the societal impact is beyond anything that it would be readily understandable here in the 21st century.
Mark, you played with the Rangers and with Atlanta and with the Angels before you got to the Yankees. Was this something that I'm sure you knew about going into the your Yankee years, but there were many constant reminders, weren't there?
Absolutely, Joe. And I think one of the things that really stands out in my mind is what Babe Ruth really set up for the Yankees organization and for just decades and decades of dominance. And the first time I ever went to Yankee Stadium, I went out to Monument Park. I was a rookie, 2003, playing for the Rangers, and feeling that history of Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, Monument Park, and knowing that it's all really because of Babe Ruth. I mean, if Babe Ruth doesn't get sold to the Yankees, there may not be a Monument Park. There obviously isn't a house that Ruth built in New York. There might be one in Boston or somewhere else, but what he set up for that city and for that franchise. And whenever I put on the pinstripes, you feel it. You feel it wearing the pinstripes and understanding what Babe Ruth meant to the game.
For sure. Bill, 54 home runs in 1920. That was more than all the American League teams combined. And there were some tape measure shots that year too, weren't there? Even though the ball wasn't, well, it had just been juiced up, I guess, that season, but still, it was unusual.
Joe, I basically became a Ruth aficionado because of his transcendent physical power. Now, of course, we know there's a lot more to Babe Ruth than just hitting a baseball. But to me, his physical ability is the conduit that leads us to everything else. And in purely athletic terms, I feel that it's the biggest story in sports history. Mark would know better than any of us, being one of the strongest hitters of the 21st century, how hard it is for a person to hit a ball 500 feet. And yet this guy born in the 19th century did it regularly. And it's the only case that I know of where an athlete born deep in our past is physically transcendent to everyone playing today. The record and the data tells us that he hit the ball harder and farther than anyone who has played the game before or since.
Even with people in the steroid era?
Even in the steroid era, yes. The data is there. Takes a while to dig it out. And of course, there are some cases where you can't document them, but there are enough, hundreds, literally hundreds, where the information and the data is beyond dispute. And the man had the pure power to consistently hit the ball over 500 feet. When you consider that it's been done only twice so far by all the joint rosters of all major league teams, it becomes a story for the ages.
Mike, you've seen the film of Babe's swing. The feet were close together. The left foot was slightly behind the right foot. Sometimes he'd run up on pitches. It was not a real conventional way of hitting, was it?
No, and you definitely wouldn't teach a kid how to swing that way. But I think what we have to understand is that his eye-hand coordination connected with that, the physical power that we're talking about is something that'll never happen again. If you think about the amount of teams that he would outslug, he'd hit more home runs than multiple teams, right? The Yankees in 2019 hit 306 home runs as a team. Imagine a player in modern era hitting 200 or 300 home runs a year. That's what Babe Ruth did. It's that equivalent. And that's what's just, so impressive to me is, I don't necessarily care about the mechanics of the swing. He was just so much better than everybody else because of the eye-hand coordination and the power.
And he really had the launch angle that we see emphasized today, didn't he?
He did. You didn't talk about launch angle with Babe Ruth and Ted Williams, but those guys absolutely preached it. I remember reading a book about Ted Williams. Obviously, if the ball's coming down, you want to swing up. It's really not rocket science. And Babe Ruth and Ted Williams both had that figured out long before launch angle was a part of our vernacular.
The science of hitting. Jane, I love the way you present his biography. It revolves around a 1927 barnstorming tour, and you go from there backwards and forwards. that he took with Lou Gehrig all around the country. This must have been amazing. I mean, to go to Toledo, Ohio, which didn't have the major leagues, or even to San Francisco. Major leagues ended at St. Louis in 1927. That was the case until expansion in 1960, or Dodgers went west in 1958, and the Giants. But here he was, larger than life on these small fields, playing in high school fields and sand lots, and drawing thousands of people. That must have been a tremendous show, almost like the Beatles coming here.
Exactly, perfect analogy. You know, Babe Ruth was a revolutionary in every way, not just in the way he played the game, swinging away and refusing to play what, you know, was called scientific baseball back in the day. You know, why should I let my manager tell me to choke up and hit the ball to the left when I can take one swing and end this thing? That was a revolutionary act and sort of audacious. But he was audacious also in hiring an agent who organized ways for him to make money in the offseason. You know, they weren't making a gazillion dollars a year. And his agent, Christy Walsh, who had faded into obscurity, would organize these barnstorming tours, and he'd make maybe 3,500, 5,000, you know, per stop. But that was pretty good money back in 1927. And when you had the two guys, Ruth and Gehrig, after that home run chase that went on throughout the summer of 27, that was a pretty good thing to sell. So Christy Walsh actually enabled Babe Ruth to earn more money off the field in 1927, probably the first time in baseball history, probably maybe even sports history, that a guy generated more income off the field than he did on it. And I picked this tour because I wanted people to feel what it was like to be him and what it was like to be around him. You know, the New York papers were, they were full of him. He filled a third of the sports section every day during baseball season. But in the, you know, out in the boondocks, where reporters were going to have one chance to hear him, see him, they wrote down everything, not just that he did, but what he said. And so it gave me a chance to be able to get some of the repartee and the relationship between him and Walsh and him and Gehrig. And Gehrig, of course, had won the MVP that year because you couldn't win it twice. And Ruth had won it in 23. So he comes alive in those places and in his interactions with fans, with kids, with women, and also with Gehrig and Walsh.
And there were near riots, weren't there? Kids running on the field. And
oh yeah, I mean, most of the games didn't get finished. I mean, they weren't really serious games. They were there to see Babe Ruth hit the ball over the fence, and they would do exhibitions before the game. By the time they got to San Francisco, and I can't remember, I got to look it up what stop it was, and they did this for 21 cities. His hands were raw and bleeding because they would do exhibitions and then they'd play a game. You know, they didn't really care if they finished the game as long as they got paid. But yes, there was a time in Trenton early on where the kids carried him off the field and literally on their shoulders and dumped him in the dugout next to the town mayor, who was busy trying to persuade Babe to come back to Trenton for Halloween, which he didn't do, by the way. But he was scared to death. And he said, I could have stepped on one of those kids with my spikes. He was really scared by that. And it happened more than once.
Of course, Christy Walsh tried to prevent him from spending all that money he made, which was a very difficult task.
Christy was the Jerry Maguire, he was the real Jerry Maguire. He was the Scott Boras of his day.
For sure. Tom, how much of the celebrity of Babe in the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, have to do with his popularity today, his notoriety today?
Yeah, well, first of all, nobody knows the story of the intertwining of Ruth and celebrity better than Jane. So read the book because you'll really get a good picture of that. I'm glad you read it, Joe. But he was that collaboration was very impressive, and Ruth was a natural. I don't think that he was consciously saying, "Oh, I've got to work this way to increase my celebrity." That was Christy was working on that for him, but he was a willing collaborator and an actively willing collaborator. He was natural in front of the camera. There was never a photographer that he wasn't going to mug for. So that was sort of the genius of Ruth, was that he was a natural and he worked well with Christie as best as you can work well with Babe Ruth. He's a wild card, so you don't know what's going to happen. But he was an incredibly impressive individual. I mean, I think one thing that people don't really, I think, appreciate enough is that the staying power of Ruth is, I think, to me, the most important thing. In the 1920s, let's not forget, Jack Dempsey was basically as big a name as Babe Ruth. I mean, his celebrity status was huge, and you just go through the papers, and Dempsey is right there, if not a number of years mentioned even more than Ruth. But Jack Dempsey lives into the early 1980s, and he lives to be a ripe old man. And Ruth dies, in 48. And if you look at the 1930s and especially 1940s, and let's go to the 50s and the 60s, Jack Dempsey just starts to fade. And yet Ruth takes off. It's a staying power that he had. So certainly it's what he did during his playing career and what he did off the field in the newspapers it's covering. But that staying power, people, you walk down the street and you ask a 10-year-old kid who Babe Ruth is, and they'll look at like of course I know who Babe Ruth is. They might not know all the subtleties to Ruth's story, but you know who Babe Ruth is. If you ask a kid who's Jack Dempsey is, they're not going to know, and that's not a knock against Jack Dempsey. Dempsey didn't have that staying power, and quite frankly, it's very hard to think of any sports celebrity that has had that kind of staying power.
That's a great point. The staying power, I think it really sums it up very well. And Mark, you mentioned you went to Monument Park. All the Yankee players, of course, knew about the Babe and about DiMaggio and Mantle and Yogi, and of course the tremendous tradition you have. But to go back now over 100 years since he first joined the Yankees really does show staying power. That's consistency.
It absolutely does, and I think when when Tom's talking about Jack Dempsey, Jack Dempsey is somebody that a certain generation is going to know. Every generation knows about Babe Ruth. My question is yes, kids today about their current best player of their generation, Mike Trout. How many kids know who Mike Trout is on the streets right now? And it just shows how big baseball was back in those days. How big Babe Ruth was more famous than the president back in those days. And for him to be able, his name to be able to last forever, and still to this day, my kids could probably pick out Babe Ruth in a lineup before Mike Trout. That is, maybe because they saw him going to Yankee Stadium all the time. But that's just an incredible amount of attention and staying power over 100 years that Tom talks about that shouldn't be underestimated.
Hey, do you think his rags to riches story has something to do with that, besides his huge persona? But he wasn't an orphan, but he grew up pretty much in either a reform school or orphanage, whatever you want to say. St. Mary's was. No relationship with his mother, very little with his father. And you really got some tremendous history there, going back to find out about his lost siblings who had passed away, and his mother's drinking issues, the divorce, which was very rare in 1906. How much did that have to do with the sustaining popularity?
Here's the thing, when you start to write a book, you got to ask yourself, is there something you can write that's different? Otherwise, why bother? And I wasn't sure in the case of Babe Ruth that there was something more to say, because the guys who came before me, including Bill, had done so much and so well. But when I read all the biographies, what became clear was the first 20 years of his life were missing. There was just like nothing, a page, a paragraph, whatever. And my reporter's, BS detector went on, and I said to myself, well, that means somebody didn't want the story to be told. And so, in fact, if you ask people today in an audience, as I have frequently, was Babe Ruth an orphan? Everybody raises their hand and say, yeah. Or, was he a criminal kid stealing stuff on the streets of Baltimore and haunting the waterfront. Oh yeah,
That's how I learned the term incorrigible. That was always
incorrigible. That was a legal term. Well, neither of those things is true. And what I was able to do, partly because the availability of digital collections of newspapers and family archives, was something that Bob Creamer didn't have, and Lee didn't have, and Tom Meany didn't have. What I was able to do is type in George H. Ruth, sorry, I didn't mean the Bushes, George H. Ruth Sr. and Katie Ruth, and up pops in the Baltimore Sun the account of their divorce and lots of other documents. And, so what was kept secret for Babe Ruth's entire lifetime, and which he clearly wanted to be kept secret. There may have been a couple of reporters that knew. I think Grantland Rice might have known. Was kept private, and it was so his horrible childhood that people think occurred at St. Mary's was not horrible at St. Mary's. It was difficult. It was lonely. It was they were unloved, albeit well cared for. What was horrible was the divorce of his parents when he was a little kid. He had already seen 6 siblings die, 3 of starvation, and he gets sent off there because neither of his parents wanted him, and because George had found Katie doing the do with one of his bartenders, threw her out in the street, and she never came back to the family again. So, it was an occasion for shame and embarrassment. You didn't have 60 Minutes or Barbara Walters to go and cry on the shoulder of a television personality and get lots of support. What you did was you shut up about it. And there's one great story in the St. Louis, what is it?
Post-Dispatch.
Thank you. Where in 1929, this reporter says to Babe, "Well, you're an orphan, right?" Now he finally gets really PO'd. He says, "God damn it, I was not an orphan. I had parents." And then he stops. He never goes further than that. And, in that day, journalists didn't go, first of all, they didn't have access to it, but if they'd had the story, they wouldn't have written it in deference to him. So what he learned at St. Mary's, other than how to hit a ball and throw a ball, was how to be public. It was overcrowded. There were 120 kids living in a large dorm, a floor made for 90, and they slept head to toe in iron cots, identically made, with not a single item of personal property, no teddy bears, no pictures from home, nothing. And what he learned to be was public. They did everything together. They slept together, they washed together, they played baseball together, they dreamed together, they went through puberty together. And so what was comfortable for him, and you see it in his ability to be public later and to love that adulation, in fact, need that adulation, was a comfort in being around a bunch of guys. That's where he felt most comfortable in his own skin. And so you come to New York in the 1920s, and it occurs at the same time. All has changed. Marketing and public relations are being invented. The idea of using an athlete or a celebrity to attach to a product. Don't you want to wear Babe Ruth's shirt and his shoes? I mean, sure, absolutely, everybody said. So, the fact that he was needed by baseball to clean up the image, and there was money, there was, disposable income to go buy Babe's shoes and sweaters and whatever, it was a perfect storm. And he was exactly the right person to become the first major modern American celebrity.
Tom, do you think that deprivation had a lot to do with his gluttony, whether it be for food or drink or women or the excesses of life? Did that have a lasting effect on him?
Well, I mean, it's what formulates the man. I mean, your youth is when you're a sponge, and you form your personality and and who you are. And so I think it's not unique to Babe Ruth. It's anybody that their upbringing is going to come through in some way, whether it means that they're going to revolt against that upbringing and do it differently, because darn it, I don't want to be like my dad, let's say, or that's they had a fine upbringing, and and that's the way they're going to live their life. So certainly that was important. And also, it wasn't a happy time for Babe, and so being, for lack of a better word, released to the Baltimore Orioles in the International League to play ball, which he obviously had talent with at that time. It wasn't like he was a complete unknown. They knew he was a good ball player. That was very eye-opening for him. The world was his oyster very early on, and he was going to revel in it, and it really didn't stop. He continued to revel in whatever he was doing.
Bill, in doing your research about his long home runs, I mean, it was certainly way before the times of home run power. Ty Cobb sort of resented him, didn't he? Who was considered the greatest player at the time.
Initially, there was quite a bit of animosity between the two, just for that reason, Joe. When Ruth replaced Cobb as the preeminent player in 1918, I think there was borderline, perhaps actual hatred from Cobb. It's a story in itself, though, about the way the relationship evolved. It was hard for anyone, including Ty Cobb, to dislike Babe Ruth, and eventually they came together as friends. And I think it's telling that when Babe died in 1948, Ty Cobb referred to Babe as the only truly natural person I've ever known.
It's quite a statement. Mark, what would you think his teammates thought of him for everything you've seen and read? How would he fit in the clubhouse?
Well, I think because he was so good, they probably enjoyed him being on the team, number one. But I'm sure there was jealousy. I'm absolutely sure. And I need to read more about that part of his life. Probably didn't get talked about a lot, but if he was in a clubhouse today, there'd probably be a lot of jealousy. He'd be the highest paid player in baseball. He'd be, the most famous player in baseball. He'd be calling shots, whether, for managers or general managers. And he was that type of player 100 years ago. So imagine, the 10 or 20 times more media attention and global media around this guy. I bet he probably would have been really enjoyed by his teammates on the field because they were winning games. But off the field, they might say, listen, this guy's taking all of our thunder and he's getting all the interviews. He's getting all the endorsements. And I'd like to hear from Bill and Tom and Jane. I mean, is that the way that his teammates thought about him, almost 100 years ago? Or was it all love?
I think you have to basically look at it financially, Mark. I mean, after all, these guys weren't making big bucks. Yes, he was, but nobody seemed to begrudge it to him because, in fact, he often doubled their income through World Series appearances. So I think there was an enormous amount of gratitude. It happens to be a myth disproven by Michael Haupert, an economist who Tom, I'm still so grateful, introduced me to, who knows more about economics of baseball than anybody. But, Babe always thought, and in his dying days said he was most proud of the fact that he raised the income level for all players throughout baseball. And unfortunately, that is not true. But he certainly raised it for the New York Yankees. And so I think there was a lot of gratitude. I don't think he was particularly well known. I think Babe Ruth was largely a loner, and that there was a part of him. And again, it goes back to the childhood. He would have a posse. He had guys that he drank with and ran around with, but I don't think he had particularly close friends.
Well, as Jimmy Reese said, he roamed with Babe's suitcase.
Yeah, he wasn't the first guy to say that. There's one of those lines like the home runs that went out of every bandbox and into the freight train going around the corner in on the rails behind the ballpark. I keep getting asked, well, I heard about one in Kentucky. Is that one true? Who knows? I just love that the stories exist.
Tom, what's the genesis of Babe's dispute with Lou Gehrig? They didn't speak for years until 1939 when Gehrig gave his luckiest man speech.
Well, actually, to some extent, when Gary came up, uh, uh, Ruth sort of took him under his wing a bit. They did have a good relationship there. Gary gets it's very hard to find a guy that's so much of an opposite than Ruth. I mean, not just in personality, and Gary was quiet and shy, had a pretty thick New York accent, but in style as well. I mean, Ruth was really an upper body swinger, and just watch him take BP, which there's a lot of footage online. You can check it out. And Gary was a rare breed at that time, where he's very muscle bound. I mean, guys back then were not ball players were usually lankier guys, but he was extremely muscle bound and very much a lower body hitter, and really almost like a drop and drive as he's swinging. So the two guys were just such an incredible contrast, and yet they're batting 3-4 in the Yankees lineup. And then by the mid-20s, the duo is an unheard of combination. But there's various stories of falling out, and questions of whether Ruth had made a pass at Gary's wife, especially during the tour they took to Japan, it hit a rough patch there. When it comes right down to it, I think that to some extent Ruth was a sort of a galoot, if I'm using that phrase correctly. He was not necessarily aware of what he was doing, the ramifications of what he was doing. He was very free and easy, but at the same time, he was very loving in that way. He was very giving and carefree, and so they kind of worked against each other a little bit in causing confusions.
Well, Babe was very tight with Lou's mother. Of course, Lou was a mama's boy, right, Bill?
Indeed, and I believe there is sufficient data to tell us exactly what happened between the two. As Tom just said, they were inseparable for several years. And then, of course, there was the famous incident. I believe that it's true that Lou's mom made a remark about the comparative attention that Babe and his second wife were giving to the two daughters. And Babe criticized Lou's mom, and for Lou, that was not acceptable. And there was a quarrel that led to an estrangement that lasted for several years until, as you mentioned, when Lou was finally dying.
Yeah, they were certainly different in death as well. I had a chance to visit both grave sites. The Babe has a huge stone, baseball player. His hand on the head of a little kid baseball player, and there are beer bottles and all kinds of Yankee pennants left on the grave. And you go to Gehrig, there's barely a marker, very, very small. It's amazing.
Bill, my favorite thing that was delivered to Babe's grave was a pizza, and the groundskeeper was so amazed. So this guy pulls up in a little Toyota, walks up to the grave, takes the box out of the thermal thing that you deliver pizzas in, and leaves it. They were all like, what do we do? Needless to say, they came back the next day and it was gone.
Billy Martin's great.
Waited.
Billy Martin's right by Babe, and
yes, he is.
Something like, I wasn't the greatest Yankee, but I was the luckiest.
I think if I can chime in on the Lou and Babe difficulty, when I went through daily coverage in at least 3 papers, and while it was not normal to quote players all the time, there were enough conversations between Babe and Lou and things alluding to things they did together, if only because they were both represented by Christy Walsh, and he would set up events for them. I do think that the 1934 trip to Japan really put a fork in the relationship. Claire, Babe's second wife, encountered Lou's new bride, Eleanor, on the deck, and they said, "Oh, this whole argument is really silly." And Claire invites Eleanor to go back to their stateroom to have some champagne and caviar. And Eleanor liked a good time, that's for sure. And she spent the afternoon there. There is no proof that I know just rumor, that anything untoward happened other than eating a lot of caviar and champagne. But Lou, meanwhile, who thought of this as his home, as their honeymoon trip, is scanning the horizon because Eleanor's been gone a long time, and he thinks she's gone overboard. And when he finally finds her sitting kind of tipsy with Babe and Claire, he goes bonkers. He'd had the captain and all the ship's crew looking for her, and he goes crazy. And Babe goes to their stateroom later and tries to apologize, and Lou was having none of it. He wouldn't speak to Eleanor for a week, and then he wouldn't speak to Babe for years.
Wow. Mark, when you played at high school ball, Mount St. Joe's, were you aware that the Babe had played there?
I was aware when I was in 8th grade and I visited Mount St. Joe. So I grew up in Serna Park, Maryland, 15 minutes or probably 25 minutes from Mount St. Joe. And so the first time I went to campus as a baseball player and looking at this all boys Catholic school down the road, they said Babe Ruth played on this field. And I said, okay, well, tell me the story. And so I heard about St. Mary's, which turned into Cardinal Gibbons. And we were all very aware that every time we played a baseball game on that field, and it's still there, it's the same field, hasn't moved in 100 years, that's the field that Babe Ruth played on. And I remember very vividly, I think it was my sophomore year, I hit a home run at Cardinal Gibbons, and someone said, hey, you just hit a home run at Babe Ruth's home field. And I remember, 10, I don't know how many years later it was, maybe 8 years later, my first home run at Yankee Stadium. And I thought back to, well, now I've hit a home run at his high school field and his pro stadium. Just something that kind of gives you chills as someone that appreciates what Babe Ruth means to our sport and to our country.
Wow, that's a great story. Wow. And what was your field like?
Our field, well, short right field porch, which was nice, deep center field, and lots of rocks on the infield, about 4 different types of grass. I went down to Georgia Tech to play baseball in college, and I saw these, just beautiful, grass fields in the ACC. And all of my teammates that grew up in the South said, oh yeah, this is what we always played on fields like this. And I said, man, if you could come up to Baltimore, Maryland, and see the fields we played on, just a little bit different, but it was fine for me. I thought it was a field of dreams when I was in high school, but obviously it was a little bit rougher than maybe some of the other guys played on.
Or maybe having to deal with that, those fields help you win those Gold Gloves.
It didn't hurt. I'll tell you that much, Joe.
And too bad you didn't sign out of high school because the Red Sox drafted you out of high school. We would have had you all.
That's a whole other conversation.
It should be mentioned that the Ripken Foundation rescued that field, Babe Ruth's field at Cardinal Gibbons, previously St. Mary's. The neighborhood has kind of gone south, and they invested a lot of money to create a sort of an all-purpose field. You can play more than baseball on it. Over time, they had switched the positions of home plate and the outfield, and they returned it to the way it had been when Babe played there. And it's got AstroTurf, but I'll forgive them given what else they've done. But it's now someplace you can go back and play, and kids actually use again.
Bill, in his later years, he suffered from throat cancer. He was really used for experimental drugs, wasn't he? I mean, this was really medical innovation.
Yes. Babe was not a frivolous guy. We should keep that in mind. He certainly was a partier, and he liked to have a good time. But I would like everyone to know that he was a prodigiously hard worker, a very courageous fellow, and he one of those rare individuals that never took a backward step. And I find that his athletic courage was a key ingredient to his success as an athlete, and that extended over to his personal life as well. And so when he had the opportunity to move medical science forward, he didn't hesitate to do it. And I think he should be remembered for that. Thanks for pointing that out, Joe.
And Tom, I've talked to Julia Ruth Stevens before she passed away in recent years, and Linda Ruth Tussetti, who lives in Wallingford, Connecticut area. They said their dad or granddad would never have put a curse on the Boston Red Sox. Is that the way you think?
Yeah, he didn't have, he just, he didn't have any control over that sale. They had to convince him to come back from Southern California, where he was actually trying to make a movie out there. It didn't happen, but they sent out, I think it was Miller Huggins actually went out there to say, hey, you're going to play for us, right? We bought your contract. And he said, yeah, as long as you renegotiate my contract, because he wanted more money, as Jay mentioned. But it's not his fault at all. Let's remember, as we were talked about, he did so much for the game, and not just, a lot of people just think of him as a slugger, and I think that's very demeaning. The guy was one of the top hitters. Forget about the slugging part. One of the top hitters. It's ironic we're talking about this now. We're taping this right after Hank Aaron passed away, and I think the same thing can be said for Hank. It's really short-sighted to think of Hank as just a slugger. Same thing with Bay. The guy was a great hitter. He was a astute base runner, and it's unfortunately remembered for being thrown out trying to steal second base at the end of the 26 World Series. But that's one anomaly, really. He was a very good base runner. But ultimately, you put the guy's entire career together. What really comes out is the statement that's on his Hall of Fame plaque, and the first words on his Hall of Fame plaque, which just say, "Greatest drawing card in baseball history," and that's what it's really about. We were talking about how did his teammates feel about him, and Mark was talking about that. And he's putting money in people's pockets. He is putting money in people's pockets now. Whether it's taking him to the postseason or just helping the team win. That was people were paying money to see the phenomenon. And just a quick example, when he was suspended prior to at the beginning of what was that the 1922 season. So he barnstormed after the 21 season, and he did so in an illegal fashion, and the commissioner told him not to do it, and he went ahead and did it because he had signed a contract to do it. But he got in trouble, and they talked him out of doing the rest of it. But they suspended him and Bob Musial for the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season. And people were complaining left and right. Well, certainly the fans are complaining. They want to see Babe Ruth, and they can't see him. But the players were complaining because he was putting money in their pockets. And the Yankees, obviously it's hurting their attendance, but every other American League team was complaining about that punishment because they got a cut of the attendance. And the attendance was really pretty bad that year up until Ruth shows up. And then the first day that Ruth plays at Yankee Stadium, they had the highest attendance they had all year, more than double what they had on opening day. Why? Duh. Babe Ruth's going to be playing. So, lots of people were not happy about him not playing. They wanted to see him play. And it's hard to argue with that. You can argue about whether he's the greatest player, the greatest slugger. I think it's like a darn good case, yes. But how do you argue against greatest drawing card of all time? That's pretty much a lock.
Well, Mike Gibbons always says he's the greatest player of all time because he pitched as well. And of course, had World Series records, 29 plus consecutive scoreless innings, 94 wins.
Listen, the pitching, I will say this. I think it's impressive. The guy started out as a pitcher, and he, was a very good pitcher, but he did only have 3 full seasons as a pitcher. So to some extent, it's a little bit of a what if. Obviously, he was on a promising track. The problem was he had great talent as a hitter as well. So we're never really going to know what happened, what would have happened. We can't say the guy was one of the greatest pitchers of all time, but it's stunning what he did as a pitcher. And, maybe if he had stayed as a pitcher, he would be one of the greatest pitchers of all time, but only had 3 seasons really that are full seasons as pitcher.
They called him the Baltimore Blizzard. That was from one of his first nicknames, Baltimore Blizzard, because of his shooters, his left-handed shooters.
Wonder how we'd show up on a radar gun today.
he wouldn't impress, but nobody would back then. The guys today are insane.
Right. And he was twice as big as everybody else on the field. That's something else that gets ignored. I mean, he was a big man, and he wasn't fat. He wasn't, all those, the caricature of his body. That's not what he was when he was growing up or when he entered the major leagues. He was kind of, a tall drink of water back then. He was 6'2", right, Bill? 6'2", and
And his first professional year is 6'2", 180 pounds.
right.
180. Wow.
Yeah, he didn't get the beer belly till later.
And he could run.
6'2".
He stole
6'2" is like
home
6'5", 6'6" now, really. I mean, it's essentially, you can add a couple inches because that's a tall guy playing ball.
You were talking about how he ran up on pitches. That's because the pitching was so slow. And, he was trying to time the slop that was being thrown. But he did understand the principles of leverage and torque. He wouldn't have used those terms any more than he would have used launch angle. But he patented the power swing that is still used today.
Indeed. Well, he's certainly larger than life. That remains to this day, even though he's been gone since 1948. We're nearing the end of our session here. Anyone have any final thoughts?
I have something, Joe. I wanted to mention that when he came to New York, it provided Babe a different kind of sociological bridge. When he was in Baltimore, there were some minorities there, and not much at all back then in Boston. When he started playing in the Polo Grounds in 1920, he was very close to Harlem, and there was a very big connection between Babe and the African American community. When he scheduled his barnstorming games after the 1920 season, 5 of them were against so-called Negro League teams. And I would like people to know how dearly beloved he was in the African American community back in those days. And I would like them to know everything that he did to help prepare for what Jackie Robinson so courageously finished in 1947. Babe Ruth had a very powerful and positive relationship with the African American community and with the old Negro League ball players. I interviewed about a dozen of them back in the 1980s, and none of them could say enough good things about Babe Ruth. So that's what I would like to add.
And Jane, you chronicle very well in your book how he visited Black orphanages as well as white orphanages.
Yes, he did. And, I think it's always dangerous in a biographer's mind anyway, to go back and apply standards of today to a very, very different time. I think I wouldn't call him a civil rights activist, but in his general welcoming of African American players, in the statement he made in 1933, I believe, to the Pittsburgh, what was it, Bill? The Pittsburgh
Courier.
Thank you. In which he talked about how Negro players, I'm using the old vernacular, would bring a lot of color to the major league game, and talked about their ability. I mean, that took guts to say that. And at a time when, the color line was so entrenched and enforced by the commissioner and the rest of the ownership. And he brought a payday. Every time he played against a Negro League team, he brought those guys a payday that they didn't get. So it wasn't just the Yankees' pockets that he was helping, or ownership's pockets. He was also helping guys who were, not used to getting what passed for big bucks back then. And I think he was equal opportunity in the best way.
Clearly, Baltimore's produced a lot of great players. The Babe, Al Kaline, and of course, Mark Teixeira. Mark, that's got to be an honor you share.
Yeah, just to be mentioned with Babe Ruth in any category, any discussion is pretty humbling. So I'll absolutely take it. Thank you, Joe.
Well, it's been a wonderful panel, and I've enjoyed reading all of you, and of course, covering Mark's games, watching him hurt the Red Sox over the years from either side of the plate, making great plays in the field, and of course, reading and knowing so much about the Babe and Mike Gibbons and all the group of the museum. This has been a wonderful experience for me, and we hope for our audience as well. So we want to thank you all. Mark Teixeira, big league player, Jane Levy, outstanding biographer, Tom Schreiber, baseball historian, and Bill, also a baseball historian and a great author. We thank Bill Jenkinson so much for being with us as we do all of our panel, and we wish you the best, and let's have a great 2021 season. And I'll go back to Mike Gibbons and company.
Many thanks for a great program, Joe, and to our outstanding panel of Jane Levy, Bill Jenkinson, Tom Schreiber, and Mark Teixeira. What a great way to continue our celebration of Babe Ruth's 126th birthday.
The Babe was born on February 6, 1895, and as you can tell from the discussion we just enjoyed, he is as relevant today as ever. If you'd like to watch this discussion again or share it with your friends, just visit our website at baberuthmuseum.org.
Tomorrow's final program, which airs at 6 p.m. right here, will be a discussion of the Orioles' defeat of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1970 World Series, Earl Weaver's only championship.
And the showcase for Brooks Robinson, who earned the nickname Hoover for his otherworldly defensive play.
Now be sure to tune in at 7:30 this evening for our live Q&A with some of our panelists from the program you just saw.
And be sure to check out our silent auction. Wonderful items, including a signed game-used bat from panelist Mark Teixeira. All proceeds support the Babe Ruth Museum. See you at 7:30, live.